Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to episode 29 of the Golden Question podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be answering the question, why do people think the majority is always right? Hopefully, the wording of that makes sense. But what I'm entertaining here is the idea that just because a majority believes in something or wants something enacted, therefore, it should be enacted and should be implemented just because it is the popular vote. Now, this obviously stems back to the idea of whether or not democracies actually work, whether or not they produce good government. And this has been debated for many, many years. It has surfaced in the ancient Greeks with Socrates, who supposedly introduced the ideas of democracy, but then towards the end of his life actually repealed back some of his ideas and started to talk more negatively about it. And recently, I would argue, the idea of democracy emerged in the creation of this country, the United States, where the founding fathers and especially the Federalist Papers, in which the framers, the founders, were discussing whether or not there should be a democracy in this country. And some could argue that the French also just prior had the same issues, and the issue started to arise. Ultimately, this stems from just because something is popular doesn't make it right. Now, from a theological point of view, right, if you're a believer in the faith, you obviously know that this is not right. Because for you to understand the truth is always the truth, no matter whether or not if everybody disagrees with it or if everybody agrees with it. The truth is always the truth. And I think from a scientific perspective, that is the case from a logical perspective, right? If something follows logic, then it is logically true. Now, again, some people can debate what constitutes as truth, but on a simple basis, if something follows the rules of logic, then it is considered logically true. The idea of voting or appealing to the popular vote or appealing to the popular masses has nothing of value to whether or not something is considered truth. And again, we can talk about philosophy here and I'll input my own opinion, but a lot of the times the truth is not what the popular vote is. A lot of the times the truth is something that people don't necessarily like or it doesn't appeal to the popular vote. And that's the beauty of the truth, is that it doesn't matter if a majority um, sees the truth or if a majority believes in the truth. The truth is the truth, regardless of who believes in it, right? If every human were to be wiped out from this earth, the truth still stands. Unfortunately, this idea is now being forgotten or discarded. Everything people now do, everything our government does, and a lot of political pundits and correspondents think that just because an issue is being dealt with by popular vote, the outcome of that vote is ultimately what's best for them. And I think the issue with healthcare comes up, the issue with public education, making college free, and they argue, hey, people support it. We have sufficient evidence that people support uh, this new program, and therefore it should be implemented. It's good, and the logic follows that if people don't want it, then it's something that's not good. Well, again, this is a surprising new idea, but what if people don't know what's best for them? How about that? Right? What if somebody thinks that they know what's best for them, but in fact, they don't know what's best for them? What if what they think is best for them is actually what's worse for them? The, with a democracy, that doesn't matter. In a democracy, the popular vote determines essentially the truth, the right way of life, how life should be lived, how everybody, including the minority, should live their life. And obviously, there's dangers in there because you're infringing on the rights of the minorities, and you can, in fact, um, willy nilly take away rights, give rights whenever you want, but most importantly, take away rights of the minority. And your only defense in that case is just because the majority wants it, then therefore it makes it right. And as we all know, that is not the case. A majority can't vote to kill one person because that person is ultimately, inevitably, going to lose that vote because he is the minority. And again, the democracy is always against the individual. It's all based on this idea of collectivism. And again, when you hear of collectivism, you tend to think of communism, you tend to think of socialism. And so all those ideas are connected. The idea of democracy is always against the individual because ultimately the largest minority is the individual. And I'm pretty sure you've heard that saying before. So going back to what people consider best for them, it isn't necessarily what we think is best for us. I think we could debate what we think is best for us, but just because we happen to have an opinion that others share, that doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do. And I think this follows the the laws, if you were to call them that, of logic and science. You actually have to prove something with evidence and back it, and for it to then become sort of a working theory or a model or a working model. And even that can then get disputed in the future. But in science, if I want to make an argument, I don't gather a bunch of scientists who agree with me and then say my argument is therefore true. That is not how science works, right? If science wants to produce an outcome, that is not how it works. It does not work democratically. It does not work by votes. It does not work by a majority. It works by understanding what we're trying to do and me actually providing evidence for my supposed outcome. In the case of government now, where government wants to pass these programs, and how does it determine whether or not to pass these programs? It simply asks the people, what do you want? What do you think? And then the majority decides what they think is best for them. You are not going to get your desired outcome. Now, the outcome is that the policies do get passed and we get what we want, but the consequences, the unintended consequences, are probably going to be things that we don't want or that we don't desire. A perfect example is the minimum wage. If we were to simply decide on whether or not a minimum wage should be passed based on majority, first of all, this is a perfect example of the rights of the majority infringing on the rights of the minority, where obviously the minority are business owners and the majority are workers. And there isn't even a question of whether or not it's correct or not because it's automatically going to get passed because there is a majority of workers and a minority of business owners. So it sort of doesn't make sense to even ask these questions that are seemingly beneficial to the workers. And it's ultimately the workers who bring up these issues of minimum wage and they go to government that has the power. And so they want to enact them. If a majority can just willy nilly pick up things that they all happen to benefit from and infringe on the rights of the minority, or in helping them better themselves, they can take away stuff from the minority, then that obviously isn't going to, again, produce an effective and successful society. You're ultimately going to run out of things to grab. And so the majority then becomes, the minority finds itself into smaller pockets of the majority. And so it just ends up eating itself alive where let's target that minority and then let's target that minority. And so each minority gets targeted until society essentially collapses where everybody turns on each other. So if again the minimum wage gets passed, putting aside the issue of an inevitable win for the majority because they are the workers, they're going to benefit from this new program. So for the minimum wage, yes, they get their intended effect in that the law gets passed and a $15 minimum wage gets instituted. But what if people lose their jobs? What if the economy slows down? What if people's incomes above the minimum wage actually decrease to subsidize for the minimum wage? What if fewer people are working? What if people's hours get cut? What if they become part time workers? What if they lose some of their benefits? A lot of these are unintended consequences of that thing that everybody else thinks that is right. And this is exactly what happens over and over again throughout the history of the United States, where people tend to vote for something or bring up an issue that on the surface seems to benefit themselves. In this case, it's the majority. It seems to benefit the majority. However, they don't look into it in depth. They don't see the long term effects. They don't see the long term consequences. They don't look far out into the future and see the effects of their policies. But for them, obviously, that doesn't matter because simply because they are a majority, they believe that their issue is right. So there is no need for them to look into the consequences and see whether or not their opinions could be wrong. The the way that the democracy is set up is that if a majority votes for something or if a majority believes something, then it is therefore correct and it is and should be enacted. You could see this over and over again throughout many different um, programs that get passed or laws that gets passed, and almost you could say really everything and anything that government does is to benefit the majority, and it ultimately hurts the people that it intends to help because, as we know, the minority and the majority are dependent on each other. They're both equal forces, right? The minority in this, if we're looking at it from the economy, the minority in this case is the rich. They provide capital, they provide the jobs, they provide the creation of goods and services, and the majority benefits from whatever they provide, and then the majority provide some of their own labor, and I think it's mostly labor. Obviously, the consumers or they provide consumption to the minority. So they both matter. And so when you take away one, you end up losing a lot from the other. Unfortunately, this idea of a democracy being inherently good in an economy and in a nation has taken this entire nation by storm. Everybody seems to believe that a democracy is good. And again, people haven't done the research. They haven't realized that there are people in the past who've debated these issues. It's not a set in stone thing where it's written somewhere democracy is good and that is the truth. And this is what's scary about democracies is that democracies tend to justify the creation of themselves, in which if a majority of people in a democracy think that a democracy is good, then a democracy stays. And this is what's dangerous about democracies is that once you have one going, it's very hard to end it. Extremely hard to end it. And ultimately, how the United States was created is that obviously the US wasn't created in Europe, where there was already established societies. The United States wasn't created in any part of the old world. It was created in an entirely new world where there was no prior civilization. Our founding fathers have created a nation, have created a civilization from scratch. And that's right there is the opportunity to say or to make sure that whatever you're trying to build is not a democracy. Because again, as I said, if our country had started off as a democracy, it's impossible to get it back because a democracy tends to justify its own existence because the majority obviously wants that democracy. Why would the majority now want to subjugate themselves and lose some of the privileges that they have by de facto of them being a majority? It's sort of saying, it's sort of asking, a rich person, do you think your assets are overvalued? Obviously, he's not going to think they're overvalued because he has everything to lose if they are. So our founding fathers have created this nation to become a constitutional representative republic. Now I'll break that up into separate terms. We have a constitution because our founding fathers knew that obviously the truth is permanent. The truth is always the truth. The truth can never be changed, even if a majority thinks that the truth should be changed, it still isn't going to change because the truth is the truth. And so our founding fathers created a constitution where there are certain portions of it that can be changed and certain portions of it that should be set in stone and cannot be changed. Obviously, the right to life, liberty, and property, and the pursuit of happiness are things that should not be changed. The right to bear arms should not be changed. All of our main Bill of Rights are things that our founding fathers intended to not change and to be constant and consistent throughout history. And our founding fathers believed those to be truths, right? Or there are certain truths to be self-evident. So these truths, even if the majority thinks that these should be removed or should be done with, that isn't going to happen. And our founding fathers knew that. They knew that democracies tend to discard the truth. And again, they justify that the removal of the truth by stating that they are the majority. So that's why that constitution is important, because it creates truths that cannot be changed by the will of the people. Now, a representative was implemented because there are certain things of the Constitution that can be voted on and can be enacted by the people, apart from the certain rights that are the truths. Now, our founding fathers believed that just enabling a majority to vote and letting each individual have the same vote as each other wasn't necessarily the best thing. And the way they argued this was that a smart person who has no idea about the law should not be given the same vote as someone who does understand the law, and in this case, it does take time to research the law and to find out its long-term effects and what have you. So if there are two individuals, they're voting on, let's say, a law to, let's say, pass the minimum wage. But obviously that's going to go in contradiction to some of the rights that people have. And obviously one of them is you can't compel someone to give money to someone else. But let's just pretend that the Constitution isn't there. So we're just purely voting on this law. Now, should these two individuals have the same vote if one of them has no idea about economics, hasn't worked a day in his life, hasn't employed anyone, should that person have the same vote as someone who does understand economics, has researched the topic a lot, understands its negative consequences, and here's the trick, he knows the truth. He knows that that minimum wage law is not going to help the economy. Should those two people be given the same vote? And our founding fathers knew that they shouldn't, right? There are going to be people who are ignorant, who don't know the future consequences, who don't know the history and don't have the intellect to understand whatever they're voting for. And then there are going to be individuals who do know, who do care about the future, who do understand the long-term effects. And so they wanted a system in which their vote, the vote of the individual who has a better understanding of the law, to carry more weight than the person who doesn't know anything and is just voting because he's bored, or somebody told him what to vote and he's just listening to them, right? So they want his vote to have less weight, or in that matter, he can be discouraged to vote. And again, this is where the left goes insane, because they see this as voter suppression. And again, I do think voter suppression, if it has a racist motive, right, if it's discriminatory, then that's negative. But I'm talking about purely in the sense of intellect, of knowing and understanding the law. If you don't know the law, should your vote weigh the same as someone who does know the law and does know the consequences? So the system that our founding fathers have devised is, you know what? Let's allow people to elect others who do know the law, who do understand the long-term consequences, who are educated and knowledgeable about the law, its future consequences, the topics. Let's let individuals elect them, and then they can elect among themselves whether or not to pass this law or not. So remember, we're still working in the framework of the part of the Constitution that our founding fathers allowed to be changed with the times. Remember, we have two parts: the parts that are concrete, don't change, they're the truth, and then parts that are malleable, that can change over time, and that are, left to the discretion of the people. And so in this system, you have individuals who don't vote for laws directly. We don't vote directly for the law to be passed. We instead vote for others who are more intellectual than us, who are more knowledgeable about the topic, and then they can decide whether or not that law should be passed or not. And I think it's a beautiful system because the individuals themselves are not voting for the laws. This again gets rid of this pure democracy. So we're sort of this representative democracy, but I wouldn't even consider it a democracy because ultimately our founding fathers wanted individuals to debate on laws, right? They wanted individuals to, or in this case, our representatives, to debate what law should be enacted, what's the outcomes, and they believe that the format of having a debate is the best way to produce the truth. And obviously, this is the most, I would argue, the most scientific way of producing the truth, of determining what is the best outcome, rather than just simply leaving it to a matter of a majority vote. And the last part is a republic. And what I have just defined to the Constitution and the representation of that, of the portion of the Constitution that is allowed to change, this is considered a republic. And as you may know, Benjamin Franklin once, again, this is a quote. I think, it's a real quote, but who knows? But it makes sense with in context. Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What are we?" I think, or in again, I don't know the full context of the quote or the full quote, but essentially, he was asked, "What are we?" And Benjamin Franklin replied, "We are a republic if we can keep it." So this again goes back to the idea where if a nation starts off as a democracy, it is, I would argue, impossible to get rid of that democracy. Impossible. Because, as I said, democracies justify their own existence by virtue of having a majority. And the majority obviously wants to stay in power, so they are always going to claim that a democracy is good and should be kept, should stay in place because the people who are a part of that majority aren't going to want to then say, you know what, a democracy shouldn't exist, and then they're automatically going to get classified in the minority. The only way for a democracy to collapse, in a sense, is for a majority of the people to agree that the democracy should be removed. But again, that's just that is impossible because you're never going to get this collective agreement to tear down, or this collective agreement for people to go on to the other side, because by virtue of them going on to the other side, they're risking their majority status and now they're becoming a minority. And unless they get together and unless the entire majority gets together, which is again not feasible, right? It depends on the population of whatever the population of this nation. Unless the entire majority of the nation gets together in one room and collectively agrees and votes on the destruction of their democracy, then that's the only way for the democracy to conclude or to end itself. But if a nation starts off as a republic, right, where we elect representatives and we have certain things in the Constitution that can't be changed, then you can slip, however, into a democracy. You can slip back into a democracy. And I think the first part is the fact that we as individuals elect our Senate. This obviously wasn't always the case. Prior to the enactment of this law, again, I'm not sure on the specifics of the law. I'm not sure even when it was enacted. It definitely was at least half a decade ago. Our Senate was elected by our representatives. So our representatives elected the senators. Today, individuals vote for the senators. Now, this may not seem like a big thing, but we are moving towards people starting to directly elect and vote for matters rather than having our representatives vote on those matters. And part of that is us directly electing the Senate. And what does the Senate do? The Senate has the power to change the Constitution. So by allowing us to vote for the Senate directly and then having them change the Constitution, you're walking a very thin line there, because our founding fathers put the electives to then elect the Senate as an added barrier to changing the Constitution. Right? We had to elect the representatives, and then the representatives elected the Senate, and then the Senate changed the Constitution. Now it's us to the Senate, and then the Senate to the Constitution. And who knows, in the future, we might soon vote on laws that directly change the Constitution. And again, we're moving, and that's obviously moving closer and closer to a pure democracy, something that our founding fathers did not want. I think that's enough. I've went on for about half an hour, and so hopefully I've sort of, again, ended up giving a brief history lesson on, um, the formation of this country. But I think it's important to know the history, right? To know how we got here, and is it wise to change something that our forefathers prevented from happening? Because again, it's I think this has a lot to do with the left. They always feel like they are better than previous. I mean, the whole idea of having a progressive is you think that you're better than the people before you. You think that you're more smarter than the people before you, and that you think you can make better decisions than they have. But again, you have to understand how, I guess, how time works, right? If you lived in that time, would you have made the same decision? Maybe you would have been exposed to different facts, different ideas that might have altered your decision into agreement with the people that you claim to be against. And it's, again, it sounds a bit cheesy, but I think the left should really humble down, right? They should really understand that maybe, the people in the past aren't just a bunch of mean people who did things because they were mean, and they are nicer and therefore they could do things better than they have. And it's really funny because you have many religions and cultures that tell you to respect your ancestors, respect your parents, in this case, respect your grandparents. And part of that is because you believe that they have wisdom. They have more life experience than you do. They've lived through history. They've lived through the problems. And so you tend to take their judgments, and you tend to accept them. And you don't have the sense of, hey, I can do better than them. I know better than them. I'm morally superior than they are. You tend to have a little bit of humbleness and to humbling down and saying, yeah, you know what? I may not know the truth. I may not know everything. They have lived more than me. They have more experience than I do. And there's a reason why they did the things that they did. And heck, how did we get here if not without them? And again, I see that missing from the left, right? The left, this idea of progressivism, right? Just wanting to move forward, forget about the past. Don't conserve anything about the past. Don't learn anything from your ancestors because they're just a bunch of mean people. Disrespect your the elderly, disrespect your parents if they, if they're mean or if you think that they're mean. And what's funny is every time I think of this, I get reminded of what happened during the rise of communist China, where you had Mao Zedong, the dictator, right, the communist leader. He sent out programs saying, "Hey, your teachers, go against your teachers if they are against the government. Go against your parents if they're against the government. Go against your great grandparents if they're against the government." It was the sense of going against the past because the past is deemed um, mean. It's deemed that they don't know any better. They're outdated. They they're not up to modern times. They're not they're morally inferior to us. And so what you saw happen was a lot of, kids naturally tended to be rebellious. They, publicly humiliated their teachers, their professors, their parents, their grandparents. They snitched on their grandparents, their parents, and their teachers, on government officials because again, they were told that if they're not doing things that are um, uh, if they're doing things that are against the government, they should snitch because against they're for the progressive. If it's not doing things that agrees with them, then they should be struck down. And this is again very widespread today, particularly the left, right? And people who think that socialism is the best system out there. And to me, I think that the reason why the left thinks that the past is outdated, that think that they're morally superior than people that have come before them, is that they don't want people to learn from history. They don't want people to learn from their past mistakes because history can show you over and over this thing doesn't work, this thing doesn't work, this thing doesn't work. And the only way for one to justify himself into thinking that this thing will work in the future or that this thing can work now is if they somehow exclude all the other attempts or somehow make an excuse or justification that completely denounces everything that has happened in the past, and so that creates an argument for them to enact it now. Again, without looking at the past. And a perfect example is just if you look at it in a more broader scope, the idea of socialism, right? This idea of communism. It's been tried over and over and over again, and even in the past, right? Big governments. This is nothing new in humanity. It's funny. Karl Marx thinks that socialism is this new thing, it's this progressive thing, when in fact it's outdated. This idea of having a big government controlling everything. Hello, we've been having that for centuries. But it's again happened for centuries. This idea of big government controlling, thinking that it knows everything, thinking that it can solve all the problems of society. That idea has been tried over and over again, and the reason why it keeps resurfacing is because people uh, train themselves to hate the past, to look at the past with contempt, and to think that the people of the past don't know any better. We could do it better this time, right? And every time I argue with a socialist, I tell them, so you think you could do it better than Lenin, than Mao Zedong, than Pol Pot, than every other king, every other dictator or ruler that has ruled in the past. You think that you are better than all of them, that you can enact the same policies that they've been trying to enact for hundreds and hundreds of years. You think that you can enact it better. And a lot of the times they tend to, I've debated with some and they say, but they didn't do this correctly. Well, of course, right? You think that you can do it better than they did. And again, you see this prevalent in the past. And this is why I think over time we've adapted ourselves into, or for people who are generally or genuinely honest and good natured people, they teach you to have respect for your elderly. They teach you to have respect for your parents. They teach you to have respect for people who have come before you, because that's the definition of wisdom, right? Humans ultimately want to become wise. And I think it's because their creator is wise. And so we want to sort of replicate that wisdom. But the definition of wise is, I think, part of being wise is being humble, understanding that you aren't exposed to all the information and that your judgment could be false, right? This idea of science is based on the assumption that that person is false and that in the future it could be disputed, right? Science produces workable models that are only applicable to now because obviously you found the evidence for it, but you have to be open to the idea that in the future somebody could come and dispute you. And this is where wisdom comes in, is that you acknowledge that you could be wrong and that people in the past um, who disagree with you might actually be correct because again you're not exposed to what they're exposed. You're not living in their setting. And I think that's why the left lacks wisdom, and part of why they lack wisdom is their complete contempt with the past and the answers to their solutions. The answers or the results of their solutions can be seen in the past. We already know the expected results of their policies. And how do we know? It's because it's in the past. But they're trying to tell you to ignore the past. Don't look at the past. They don't know any better. There are a bunch of bad people. The people today are better than the people in the past, and therefore we can try to reattempt the same policies. And again, that's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's why I think democracies have been tried over and over again, and yet people think that they will always produce good government. Meanwhile, history has taught us that democracies do not, in fact, produce good government. And our founding fathers, who've lived centuries ago, 200 years ago, have learned from that mistake and they've enacted a republic. And I believe that they had wisdom in their decision and that they know better than what the majority thinks they know today.